Yeah, thank you, Leif Larsen, dear John, Rune, and all the others that were involved in preparing, setting up this conference, and thanks for inviting me to have this opening speech. I'm honored to do so, and with this I'm also going back to my indeed philosophical route, because before becoming a media study guy, I was like a real decent philosopher, reading books in the library and not looking at images and not playing games during these times at all. But luckily that changed. Well, anyway, let me start with the unavoidable question. What is philosophy? An obvious answer is philosophy is the love of wisdom. But that's only a translation of the literal meaning. So instead of answering that question, what is philosophy, we should take into consideration that this formulation is elliptical, means an important term is omitted, as the full question should read, what is philosophy about? And philosophy is not about wisdom, as you might think, because philosophy has to be practiced to become wise. But what philosophy rather is about is truth. It's simply as that. Philosophy is about truth. The only tricky thing here is that philosophy never seeks the truth as such, since the aim is wisdom and not truth. Instead, philosophy does reflect truth. This is, philosophy considers the conditions of truth. Philosophy is about truth, it is the matter of truth. And this in particular applies to space. Philosophy does not seek the truth of space, that is the true concept of space, but philosophy is about the truth of space, hence about the various concepts of space as to be found, for example, in physics. This becomes even more, Here finally lies the difference between philosophy and science. Science does seek the truth. In this case, physics seeks the true concept of space. Philosophy does not, since it knows that any truth is bound to certain conditions. As much as the question, what is philosophy, cannot be avoided, when it comes to space, obviously, one can hardly avoid Immanuel Kant. Kant is one of the best examples of someone who started as a scientist of space and later turned into a philosopher of space. Because in his early treatise on space, like Universal Natural History from 1755, Kant invented models that today are appraised as forerunning the Big Bang Theory. Not the TV series, I mean the physical theory. Or he tried to solve the dispute between Newton and Leibniz about the truth of space. That is the question whether space truly is absolute or relational. However, when Kant then turned into a philosopher of space, which happened more or less within a 10-year break of writing between his dissertation and the Critique of Pure Reason, he withdrew from the question which concept of space is true and called space simply a form of intuition. Intuition hereby means an insight that is recognized immediately. Again, Kant is not saying which concept of space is true, even though he as a scientist was convinced that his former findings about space were still right. But along the notion of space, he demonstrates that philosophy has to determine what the conditions are under which a certain concept of space can be called true. This becomes even more explicit when looking at Kant's answer to the Leibnizian philosopher Johann August Eberhard in a text called On a Discovery Whereby Any New Critique of Pure Reason is to be made superfluous by an older one, from 1790. They had nice book titles back then, in which Kant reacts to the interpretation that takes his term, form of intuition, as the claim that Euclidean space is innate, an opinion that indeed became very prominent in the 19th century amongst physiologists, and in 20th century in developmental psychology like in Jean Piaget. In his book Honor Discovery, Kant writes that, quote, only the possibility of the intuition of space, in German Raumanschauung, is innate, but not the spatial representation, that is the Raumvorstellung, here be it the Euclidean, itself. So not a certain concept of space is given to the subject according to Kant, but the mind is capable of gaining immediate insight into the truth of space, or rather a truth of space. Kant himself demonstrated this, and this is a confusing part, in the Critique of Pure Reason alongside Euclidean geometry, by stating that the mind can gain immediate insight into the truth of geometrical axioms, like the constant sum of the angles of a triangle, being 180 degrees by definition. This statement has misinterpreted as the conclusion that Euclidean geometry is the truth of space, which then in turn was proved wrong by non-Euclidean geometry. This is what the critics said. But since alternative geometries were just about to be developed, Kant could not use them as an example yet. And beyond no doubt, he would have agreed that the mind could get immediate insight into the truth that a spherical or hyperbolic triangle can exceed or fall below the sum of 180 degrees. Well, to finally justify the main title of my talk, Antinomies of Space, I now want to take one more step with Kant and focus on those announced antinomies. Antinomies are contradicting or incompatible laws, Greek nomoi, that according to Kant cannot be solved by argumentation, since the laws in question are beyond the capacity of reason. One crucial example for an antinomy of pure reason, as Kant calls it, in regard to our topic, is a dispute whether the world has a beginning in time and is limited in space, or it has no beginning in time and no limits in space. Instead of arguing for one or the other, philosophy as meta-science should be about this scientific antagonism and should not support one position or the other. Well, this is the idea of a critique of this antonymical structure. Deviating from Kant now, I think that in recent debates on space, not this antinomy about the beginning of the world is any more relevant, but at least three other antinomies that do dominate the present spatial discourse. And I want to point out these to you now. The first antinomy is one we predominantly can find in social science. It is the antinomy of deterministic against possibilistic concepts of space. The deterministic understanding goes back at least to the German geographer Friedrich Ratzel, who in his Anthropogeography from 1882 applied models from natural geography onto human geography. This is stating that a certain natural environment or climate does determine a certain vegetation, respectively a certain behavior, or even the existence of various races, from which Ratzel adopted the term Lebensraum, life space, from zoology. On the other hand, we can find, just in the same historical layer, understandings of space which are possibilistic. In French geography, one could name Paul Vidal de la Blache, who says that people do shape space according to their needs. A more prominent possibilistic position, however, is the approach of Georg Simmel, who in his Sociology of Space from 1903 claims that the shape of a territory, or its topography, is not the cause for cultural or social development, but an effect of a given social order. For example, to Simmel, a centralized urban architecture, as in Paris, is an expression of a result of a centralized society, whereas a grid plan organization, as it can be found in New York, but already in ancient Greece, as in the city of Miletus, it is an expression of social equality, hence democracy. Possibilistic and deterministic conception of space constitute the first antinomy, with the claim that the space is a result of society, respectively, society is a result of space. And that's also, just a side remark, that's also a reason why sociologists and historians hardly can talk about space in the same way, because historians always look back on society and think space has determined structures, and sociologists more or less look at the present and the future and have this possibilistic approach. So bring them together in a conference on space and they are not able to talk together because this is a spatial antinomy. The second antinomy we can find in present discourse is that of intensification against dissolution of space. For the latter, the work of Paul Virilio is relevant, as he diagnosed the disappearance of space due to the acceleration of transport, the transport of goods, of people, and as well as information. To Virilio, distance is no longer measured in length, but in duration. For example, I don't ask how far Berlin is from Bergen in kilometers, but how long it takes me to get from there to here by certain means of transportation. The British-American geographer David Harvey calls this the compression of space in the postmodern era, being the most significant characteristic of this period. On the other hand, that means on the other side of the second antinomy, we can find positions, for example, coined by Nigel Thrift, also a cultural geographer, who in his book on spatial formations from 1996 argues that due to this acceleration, space is not compressed at all, but expands as an increase of possible personal experience of the world throughout the generation, as this schema on the right-hand side is pointing it out. Again, like in the first antinomy, we have contradictory conceptions of what the truth of space is. Does it determine or is it man-made in the first antinomy? Here, does it vanish or is it intensified? So let us go on to the third antinomy. This is, however, the most prominent one, especially within philosophy. It is the antinomy of space against place. In fact, space and place seems to be, or space versus place, seems to be the meta-antinomy of the philosophy of space, especially when we look at 20th century phenomenological philosophy. After publishing the book Getting Back into Place in 1993, the American philosopher Edward Casey in 1997 has devoted a full book to that question, named The Fate of Place, in which he describes how places as the very spatial concept of ancient philosophy, namely in Aristotle, was abolished in modern philosophy and physics before it reappeared in 20th century phenomenology, arguing that the body is the medium of experience, and since the body is always located somewhere, the ground of space is place. This idea then again is traced back to a Kantian argument, namely the one against Leibniz, that a space defined by relation needs a subjective standpoint in order for directions in space to make sense. Otherwise, space would not be oriented. Most prominently for the revaluation of place against space in phenomenology is Martin Heidegger's talk on architecture entitled Building, Dwelling, Thinking, where he words, this famous quote, spaces, that is in German Räume, receive their being from locations, in German Orte, which is actually places, so wrong translation, and not from space. Spaces receive their being from locations and not from space or the space. This was directed by Heidegger against Newton and natural science in general. Insofar space is taken as given independently from bodily experience, and its measurement thus being independent from the observer. Something overthrown actually by quantum mechanics within Heidegger's times by his pen friend Werner Heisenberg. So there is always also an influence between the science of space and the philosophy of space. I'm not neglecting that. For Heideggerian phenomenologists, the homogeneous absolute space then becomes identical with a hostile environment. And to overdo it a little, space from now on to phenomenology was just evil, whereas place was the good, the radical human, the innermost constituency of the life world. Again, we have to bear in mind that philosophy should not seek the truth of space, but is about the various truths of space. And to a certain degree, the founder of modern phenomenology, Heidegger's precursor Edmund Husserl, was aware of this, since he explicitly wanted to turn philosophy into something else, namely in something he called rigorous science, strenge Wissenschaft, as the paper was entitled in 1911, Philosophie als strenge Wissenschaft, philosophy as rigorous science. So he wanted philosophy to become science and not be philosophy anymore, because it should seek the truth. To this end, philosophy should have a compulsory method, the phenomenological one, and a ground. The ground being the subject, the body, or finally the earth itself, as Husserl claims in a later text. The method to use being that of the phenomenological reduction, by which all accidental aspects of the appearances are removed in order to arrive at the very essence of phenomena. But as we know, this project to establish a philosophical compulsory method for all philosophers on the basis of an uncircumventable instance has failed, and with it the necessity to acclaim the primacy of place within the philosophy of space. This applies also to phenomenologies of space like the one by Michel Desserteaux, who seems to be opposed to Heidegger when Desserteaux claims that places are dead, coordinates on a map for example, whereas space derives from bodily practice as spatialization. Here simply the terms are exchanged. What Heidegger calls space as a homogeneous concept to Desserteaux is place, or lieu in French, and what Heidegger calls place, the heterogeneous concept, to Desserteaux is space, French espace. Well, after this critique of spatial reason alongside the three antinomies, the next step for philosophy is, of course, a dialectics of space. That means, after Kant, there's always a Hegel awaiting. The Hegel on hold here is the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre, who today would hardly be known anymore other than being the tutor of Jean Baudrillard. But Lefebvre was one of the most efficient philosophical writers in the second half of the 20th century, who published at least one monograph per year. Amongst those was the book La Production de l'Espace, Production of Space, which in its year of its original French publication, 1974, wasn't successful at all. People more or less wondered how space, which in those days was immediately understood as outer space, could be produced. It was not until the year of Lefebvre's death in 1991 when, with the English translation, the book achieved a prominent role in the spatial discourse, even advancing to become the Bible of what is now called the spatial turn. And this was due to Edward Zoja, another American geographer, who already in 1989 introduced the term spatial turn by chance when he tried to explain a shift in social theory where, due to the heritage of deterministic concepts of space, the term space was banished from social science after the Second World War. On the contrast, Zoja notices a turn amongst neo-Marxist philosophers towards space in order to address social issues. So not the social was in question anymore, but space as a product of society. Well, this seems to resemble Simmel's theory of space, but indeed it goes much further than that, as Zoja then demonstrates in his book Third Space from 1996, where he gives a close reading of Lefebvre and made him the central figure of present space thinking. Whereas Simmel just formulates one law of space, namely that of possibilism, in contradiction to deterministic concepts of space, and thus remaining within the antinomy, Lefebvre has a dialectical understanding of space that includes something which is also vital in the second antinomy I pointed out, namely space is a subject to change, which, for example, can vanish or increase. So let's have a closer look at Lefebvre's dialectics of space, which Edward Soja calls a trialectics, probably because he's not well at Greek, thinking that dia means two, whereas it translates as through, indicating the process of something going through the logos, which in turn means language, mind, meaning, spirit, or finally culture, as we could say today. Anyhow, to understand Lefebvre's dialectics, it is important to bear in mind at least three things. First of all, Lefebvre gives an analytic description of an ongoing synthetic process. Therefore, he introduces terms that seem to be confusing or ambivalent. They are simply ambivalent by intuition in order to indicate the spatial process. Secondly, anything Lefebvre is saying about space is said under the perspective of modes of production or reproduction. So, to Lefebvre, there is no given space that is not already produced. And be it nature, being a product by a certain theoretical imagination of it, like the untouched nature or the wild nature. And last but not least, thirdly, when Lefebvre talks about three different spaces, this must not be understood as three different places, rooms, or spatial segments, but rather as three different aspects of the dialectical process. So, here we go. These three aspects are spatial practice, representations of space, and representational spaces. Some Lefebvreans call this the semiotic triangle of his spatial theory. And in addition, there is a phenomenological triangle describing the modalities in which these aspects of space do appear. Spatial practice is perceived, representations of space are conceived, and representational spaces are lived. The confusions I was warning you about lurking at least at two instances. The possible confusion, firsthand, of represented spaces, number 2, and representational spaces, number 3, and the question why spatial practice is said to be perceived and not lived, which according to Lefebvre is the mode of representational spaces. The second question can be answered easily. Here, deliberately, Lefebvre wants his reader to think of representational spaces already feeding back into the spatial practice via spaces being lived. So what is culturally lived by many individuals is also perceived by each individual of this group. And if somebody is unhappy with the term perceived sounding too passive, one here could also read performed, if you wish. This first confusion, however, is a bit more difficult to resolve. For what is the difference between representations of space and spatial representations? Well, in semiotic, since Nelson Goodman, we do know two ways of representing something with something. One is symmetrical and the other one is asymmetrical. In the asymmetrical relation, you can only use signs to designate an object, but not the object to designate a sign. For example, the expression glass to designate the object on the table, but you cannot use this object in order to represent the shape or the sound of the words. But what you can do instead is you can use the glass on the table in order to represent another glass being here, or if we go down to the restaurant and ask for more, we just point out this one to the people down there. This way of representing something with something, Nelson Goodman calls the symmetrical way to represent, and this is what also we can call an exemplification. That means you give an example of something, and by this, the object you use to represent is part of the set of things that are represented by it. So there is the asymmetrical way of representation and the symmetrical way of representation. And this now we can try to map on the two ways of representation in Lefebvre. Let me give you, therefore, an spatial example. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. This surely is an object of spatial practice. Hence, it is produced in daily perception or performance by people using it to cross the bay. But there's also the representations of the bridge that in first place were made in order to build it. So the constructors and engineers, Ammann and Strauss, did calculate the statics and drew sketches of the bridge, being asymmetrical representations of the bridge. The calculation represents the bridge, but the bridge does not represent the calculation. This is a mode of conceiving space, which can be found in architecture and urban planning. Edward Socha would here add, in addition, any spatial science that is, or any science that is concerned with space, as physics, geography, and so on. But the bridge then finally is also an exemplification of something. First of all, it exemplifies similar bridges with which relevance in the life world is not only to connect people and literally bridge a gap, but also to go beyond a given point. The bridge then also exemplifies the self-understanding of US America, which in spatial respect is the assumption that there are no final borders, but just a frontier that can be pushed forward. And once the limits of the country in the West are reached, as it is in San Francisco, one can go vertical to outer space. This frontier mentality and the bridge do exemplify each other. It's a symmetrical way of representation, hence a representational space according to Lefebvre. By this, the Golden Gate Bridge is not only produced through a mathematical calculation or the daily use of commuters, but is also a representational space that is culturally lived. Just a disclaimer to this example. I, in line with Lefebvre, am not saying that those meanings are stable, because this is just an example, or that my spatial interpretation of the bridge is true for all times. Because I just want to give you an example how to understand this. But, and this is a crucial point, just by giving you this example, I already also contribute to the production of space. So we cannot really escape this process of producing space, even though if you're going to offend this example, for instance, which I was just using to point out the 3 dimension. So it's spatial practice, commuters using it across the bridge is the plans that were drawn in advance for constructing the bridge by Ammann and Strauss. And then there is the idea of what does this bridge exemplify by its structure of being a bridge, bridging a gap, and pointing towards Land's End. Well, with this, let us finally go to the theme for which we all are actually here, computer games. You might have recalled in the course of my Lefebvre interpretation, this philosophy of space has already been used in game studies. We could even say that the reason why we are having the topic of space in the philosophy of computer games series, and John was a little bit aiming at that, is due to a very early interpretation of Lefebvre in computer game studies, namely the interpretation of Espen Aarseth in his paper Allegories of Space, which was published online already in 1998 and in print in the Cybertext Yearbook 2000, as well as in a German translation in the Journal of Semiotics in 2001, before it got reprinted in a shorter version 2007 in the seminal reader Space, Time, Play. Since Espen wrote his paper during his time here in Bergen, we could say there is probably no better spatial and theoretical coordinates thinkable for this venue, also bearing in mind that his paper is discussing Anita Learfall's interpretation of Kant. So, in his reading of Lefebvre, Aarseth claims that the difference between the two kinds of representation is the one that spatial representations are conceptual, in Lefebvre they are conceived, and representational spaces are associative, in Lefebvre they are lived. which would equal what I have called the asymmetrical or denotative against the symmetrical or the exemplificatory way of representation. However, the synthesis of the two aspects for Orsett is not that the representational space is dialectically feeding back into the spatial practice, but that computer games as virtual spaces are reductions of real space or representation of spaces that are experienced as symbolic or rule-based structures, which then are only, as the title of his paper reads, allegories of space, but not real space. As I tried to point out earlier, this interpretation would have been rejected by Lefebvre, since to him, even the real space is produced. Produced by what? The answer is by representations of space, as well as by representational spaces. So I do agree with Stephan when he writes that, quote, the nature of space is not revealed in this operation, that means in the dialectical step from spatial representation to representational spaces, but I think from a philosophical point of view that the one true nature of space will never be revealed. We only have scientific findings which use certain models or representations of space that in their context are presented with a claim of truth. Well, since Stephan Orsett's paper, Lefebvre's dialectical conception has been applied several times on computer games. One example is a text just published in 2001 by Sean McLausich from the University of Illinois on virtual realities, SimCity and the production of urban space, here posted again in 2006. McLausich discusses SimCity as a game in which only a representation of space exists, that likewise dominates the spatial practice and the lived space. Or more precisely, to McLausich, there is no lived space in the game at all, but only a cartographic representation of space. A further example is Axel Stockburger's 2006 dissertation on the rendered arena, in which the three modalities of space, according to Lefebvre, are used to differentiate between, firstly, the user space of practice, including a social dimension, secondly, the abstract realm of rules and fiction as representations of space, and thirdly, a kinesthetic spatial lived experience constituted by the first two. A slightly different idea then we can find 2 years later in Michael Nitsche's book on video game spaces, where the spatial practice is equaled with the rules set up by the medium, the computer or the gaming console. The representation of space are found on the screen as the mediations of those rules, and representational spaces are the result of interacting with those fictional mediated rules. Well, even though I agree with Stockburger and Nitsche that those aspects are crucial moments of the dialectical production of space, I would still like to go back to the original idea of Orsett and try to find the three modalities of space within the game itself, without omitting the first space of practice, as Orsett does, or in addition also omitting the third space, as McLausich does, and still not identifying the lived space with the player's contingent gamic or social experience, as Stockburger and Nitsche propose. In my view, there are at least two ways of doing this. The first one is something I developed in my book on space image of computer games published last year, so just a short commercial break for that here. The idea is to find the dialectical moments of spatiality within a decisive computer game genre, namely first-person shooter games. Here the perceived space would be the one of the first-person perspective from which the main spatial practice, aiming at objects and shooting them, arises. This is accompanied by a spatial representation, not of a natural space found outside the game, but of the space in which the spatial practice is taking place in the game. Since the representation of that space is offering a different view on the game world, and by the same time depriving the user more or less from the possibility of direct action, the dialectical spatial process gets going. The result, the dialectical result, is a particular experience of pathways through game space, which in their full possibility can be represented but never be actualized all the same time. By this, the image of the computer game is not only an illusionary image space established by the perspective of the ego, but rather a space image which at the same time is perceived, conceived, and lived by the users. However, I not want to go into details of this way of applying Lefebvre. It's one offer one could make. But I want to come up with another new suggestion for our conference. And with this, I also want to close my talk. The suggestion refers back to my interpretation that the two different ways of representation according to Lefebvre are that of denotation and exemplification. The denotation carried out by the representation of space is that of a space in which the action is carried out. This is pretty much in line with Nietzsche or with Jesper Juhl, who said that, and he said this without referring to Lefebvre in his book Half Real, stating that the fictional depiction on the screen mediates the rules imposed by the gaming console or the program, no matter if we call them rules or not. That we were debating the whole day yesterday. Okay. But now, here comes the important philosophical twist. What is exemplified by those representations is not the impossibility of a true depiction of real space, as in Orsett, but what the truth according to spatial sciences is. To say it again a little differently, what is exemplified by computer games as representational spaces, these third spaces, is not the impossibility of a true depiction of real space, but what is exemplified by computer games are different spatial concepts. Let me give you an example, another unavoidable example I have to admit. Tetris. A game which prominently has been interpreted by Janet Murray in Hamlet on the holodeck as, quote, an enactment of the overtasked lives of Americans. So we could say with Lefebvre, the game exemplifies this particular life world inasmuch as the lives of Americans exemplify the gaming principle, without either or depicting the other in an appropriate way. However, this interpretation is not particularly relevant for space or spatial theory, but mainly only for how Tetris could be taken as an exemplification. I think that's what Janet Murray is doing here, is interpreting Tetris as an exemplification of the life of the Americans. But taking Tetris as an exemplification of space, that is as a representational space or third space in the Lefebvre sense, I come to the conclusion that Tetris represents or exemplifies space according to Aristotle. Because in Aristotelian physics, any object was given a certain place, Greek topos. And since the ancient worldview did not allow for empty space to be, this would equal an imperfectness of God, movement through space in the modern Newtonian sense is not thinkable. Instead, for Aristotle, the objects simply swap places. In art history, this is also known as the horror vacui, the fear of empty space, still to be found in medieval architecture or painting, like in the portal of the Strasbourg Dome. I have to admit at this point that in Tetris, we do actually have the impressions of a continuous movement, namely of the falling bricks. So Tetris space might be partially Newton, but in the important part of the game space, it is Aristotelian, namely when the bricks take over the final position. They can only inhabit given places or topoi and cannot be positioned in between. In some respect, Tetris is also a strange inversion of the horror vacui, since users have to try to enforce emptiness by clearing the bricks, whereas the system heads for the total filling of space. That means trying to introduce the Aristotelian worldview in total. However, what Tetris would look like if it totally exemplifies Newtonian space, on the other hand, can be seen in Tetris Hell or in the similar game Not Tetris, both from 2010. Here the bricks do not end up in designated positions or places, and they also can still fall over due to gravitation, as it would be the case in a Newtonian space. For another example of the exemplification of spatial theory, we can have, as a second example, a look at text-only adventure games like Advent or Zork. What can be found here is the exemplification of a relational space, something the mathematician Leibniz claimed to be the true nature of space, against the physical conception of Newton, stating that space is not defined by volume or distance, but is an effect of the relation between objects, as it can be seen in a player's drawing of the topological relations between the singular spaces in Zork, not caring about the metrics of this space at all. But to be more precisely, just like we can find a Newtonian space within the Aristotelian space of Tetris, we can find a dimensional space in Zork when descriptions are given of what could be seen in a game world if it would be not a text-only game, but a graphic adventure. Like, quote, "You are 10 feet above the ground, nestled among some large branches." But as soon as it comes to spatial actions, distances don't matter. It's just go east, go north, go south, you type in. One here could argue, like Kant as a scientist did, that directions only make sense when a subject is located, whereas Leibniz said space derived from the relations themselves. But I think that directions, as well as supposed subjects of action, here in the game can be taken as a pure relation between knots in a topological graph. It is not important to know where the directions really are, but for example, that south is the opposite of north, and in between neighboring these two are east and west. Inverting the schema would make no difference for the game as long as the relation stays the same. Here, opposition and neighborhood. But I think this will be more discussed in Anita's paper then later on. My last example now, of course, are again first-person shooter and also third-person shooter games. I find this the most interesting case, since those depictions are usually taken as images that do try to imitate real space. And we all know very well the rhetoric of game publishers announcing the stark realism of next-generation games. But the first-person and as well the so-called third-person perspective from a philosophical point of view have not to be taken as depictions of real space, but also as exemplifications of spatial concepts, namely of concepts we find in physiology and, I already talked about it, in early phenomenology. First-person shooters thus being an exemplification of the claim that real space is a perceived space characterized by its perspectival structure. A famous example for this is Ernst Mach's self-portrait in the analysis of sensation from 1886, where he tries to demonstrate by a drawing how he perceived the world in a subjective, personal way. First-person shooter games thus make use of the same perspective and similar features, only switching over the pencil for a gun. With Lefebvre, this has not to be taken as an attempt to imitate real space, but as an attempt to demonstrate how space looks like according to a certain spatial theory or spatial science, when it became a representational space. In this case, the cultural belief since the Renaissance that a subjective pictorial structure is capable of representing the world objectively, which indeed is a paradox. Same applies to third-person shooters. Instead of taking them as denotations of real space, they should be interpreted, from a philosophical point of view, as an exemplification of a truth of space which psychopathologists claim to be the real space of schizophrenic persons that do experience an out-of-body situation. That's why, taken philosophically, the term third-person perspective is appropriate. For the structure of the image then would have to suggest that the person looking at the character in the image is not me as the character, but an uninvolved, hence third person, as it is, for example, the case in a platformer game. Rather, the space exemplified in games like Max Payne or Tomb Raider has an autoscopic structure. It exemplifies a space in which the ego does see itself from outside. With these examples, let me come to a conclusion. What we can get from those attempts to apply Lefebvre on computer games in a slightly different way than others have done it before, what I want to convince you to with that is that as philosophers of computer games, as what we all want to try to be, to take a different stand in regard to space. And this is namely that our duty is not to say what space really is, or which geometrical, physical, or phenomenological concept of space is the best to read games with, but instead what should identify the different concepts of space to be found within computer games, offering users a spatial experience enabled by the intuition of space as form. Well, who knows? This philosophical view in the end might bring us all a little closer to wisdom. Thank you.
Now we have about 20 minutes for discussion. So I think we can just ask if is there a microphone for people who want to ask a question?
Try this.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I stay here and people step up to that microphone.
I think maybe the best way
Yeah.
to do like that. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, better, yeah. So, are there any questions? It was a very detailed and very interesting talk, actually. I think it gave us an awful lot to think about. It might be difficult to find things to ask questions about, but I'm sure somebody has some comments. Since everybody's been working on space in order to prepare for the conference, there should be some things to discuss.
Hey.
Ah, okay. So,
Well, we could start with a proposal.
no, if nobody has anything to begin with, I thought maybe it could be interesting to discuss this. You said philosophy of computer games is to identify the different concepts of space to be found within computer games, offering users an experience. Could you maybe say a little bit more about how concepts offer experiences? And where do the concepts dwell? Are they in the rules of the game, in the architecture of the space, or the experience of the person of the real world in real world spaces? And are people's, let's say, their experiences of game space, are they simulations of being in real spaces? With a different set of concepts. Are they the same concepts as real spaces, or are they different?
Okay, so let me start with what you're saying in the end, that this is actually the approach I'm going totally against.
You have that, okay.
That okay. Yeah. So this is what take you out of this approach, which we can sometimes find in philosophy. That means that you have this, I don't know, is this the immersive fallacy? I don't know, but this is like, so we confuse something we see on the screen with reality. So, and this is well, this is not a necessity of at all to presuppose that on the images we can find, on the pictures, on the spatial structures we can find in computer games. I also don't say that designers did that on purpose. So Tetris, first-person shooter game and so on, they had different ideas behind it. I think people doing first-person shooter games, they were really trying to imitate real spatial experience. But what I find interesting from a philosophical point of view is to start to think of these spaces offered by computer games not as being bad or poor imitations of the world, but as an offering, a possibility of a spatial experience we would usually not have outside of computer games, or only few people would have, like schizophrenic people. I also don't say that we become schizophrenic by playing third-person shooter games, because then half of people here would be schizophrenic. So, and this is a kind of indicator that the same time that what people sometimes say that is a strong influence of computer game structures or narrations or whatever is found on the real life world. I'm also not saying that, because this is also what these models are hinting at in Nietzsche and so on, where they all say, well, this feeds back into the social space. It does in some way, but I think that is not the first philosophically interesting thing. So what I say is we can try to read or interpret those spaces with the tools we have from this long, or this models we have from the strong and long history of spatial concepts in science, already discussed by philosophers of space. These were like the big models of, I named Aristotle, Leibniz, Newton. I went on to phenomenology. We could add much more to this. There are hundreds and thousands of concepts of space. And I think in the past there was no possibility of people living or experiencing those spaces other than reading those books, for example. Another example would be, it's because, I don't know if anybody came across the new edition of Linda Henderson's book on four-dimensional space models and modern art. So she was about saying that Picasso is not so much influenced by Einstein's space-time theory, but much more by discussions that the fourth dimension is a higher dimension of space. And from this, the whole hypercube art thing is coming, and people saying that our world is just a shadow of the fourth dimensional world, and we have to try to think of this fourth dimension. And so there were a lot of artists trying to give us an image of of a possible experience of this fourth dimension we could never see in our real world. Yeah. So, and another unavoidable example in philosophical, or in a conference on computer game space, is Portal. So I would say Portal is exactly in that tradition. It gives us an image, here an interactive image, that allows us to experience fourth dimensional space, leaving aside the question whether space is 3, 4, or 11 dimensional. That's, you can leave over to physics. But it gives us a possibility of experiencing fourth dimensional space. Even though this picture is still 3-dimensional, but we have to think of it as being 4-dimensional. So, and this is what I'm trying to say. There are many more examples, and we've got this rich history, or this strong history of spatial models in physics, in geography, anywhere else, in social science, and it's hardly been tried to apply this on computer games as an interpretation in order to get closer to what the specific experience of a computer game space could be. So, sorry for that long repetition of what I've already said.
Very useful. Has there anybody else been inspired? Runa was very quick, also there. We give Rune the word first.
Thanks for your presentation. It was both educational and inspirational, I think, about exploring the various kinds of spaces that computer games can be, based on the conceptual models that we have. My question would be, what about, you didn't address cinema, probably for good reasons. What about cinema as a model, as a cultural history, as an experience?
Yeah. Well, on the one hand, we could say that any art form, especially any visual art form, we could try to read in that way, so that, say, between Henderson reading pictorial or painterly art, we could do that to sculptures. I've done it to games. We could try to impose that on cinema as well. What could be also a possibility, I mean, I haven't done that, I didn't do that on purpose because it's a conference on computer games, but what we actually also could do is say that computer games sometimes are already an exemplification of cinematic space. That's what I was getting. So that would be an option in the third-person perspective, in the so-called third-person perspective, to say that, well, this is not the schizophrenic situation in the first place, but it's the camera situation. Whereas when we have this camera situation in cinema, it's also a schizophrenic situation, because at the same time we're asked to identify ourselves with the body we see from behind or in front. And it's not so much that we've got this following perspective in the movies, so it's quite rare anyway. But you're right, we could also try to engage with cinematic spaces. What we could try to read cinematic spaces with taking a physical concepts would be like this separated or segmented spaces. So when you got a parallel montage or a cut, the spatial experience behind that could be one you will find in very early and pre-Socratic philosophy of space, where they say there are really some nests of space located somewhere. This is Pericles, I think, so that's a very old conception of space, so nested spaces. So maybe this is what cinema offers as a spatial experience, but that's just at first glance.
Okay, you were first out. Maybe you could say your name and ask the question. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Karl Mildenberger. I'm from University of St Andrews. I really like the suggestion you're making that we can use computer games as really offering the user a way to experience different conceptions of space. But I'm wondering, like, from a purely philosophical perspective, is this everything there is to computer game space? I mean, you seem to be suggesting that we can use it as a tool. Now that's interesting. We can use computer game space as a tool to, well, for our intuitions of space. But is this everything there is to computer game space? I mean, you don't seem to be addressing what computer game space is, to be really philosophical.
Right. Yeah. As I said in the beginning, the aim of philosophy is to become wise. And the philosophers who seem to be the most wisest of all philosophers were the skeptics. Because, you know, they were always looking for the antagonisms, and by this they went into this state of ataraxia, or what is it, peace of mind. But we say, well, this is a philosophical situation, you know. And that's what I'm aiming at too. So I'm not saying that you cannot do something else in philosophy of space. You can, and I said this is the ambivalence in Kant, that he's at the same time a scientist of space and tried to prove that philosophically. You know. So, but I would say my advice is, if you want to become a philosopher, be more skeptical.
Hi, I'm Shobik Mukherjee from Presidency University, Calcutta. Stephan, as always, this wonderful presentation, and I have much to learn from it, and certainly for the presentation I'll be doing tomorrow here as well. I had one question, which is actually two. When you're thinking of trialectics, how is the trialectic translating into games, and why is it different from dialectic? You said Soya got his Greek wrong. I mean, it's through, not to, but there is this synthesis part as well. Is lived space the synthesis of perceived and conceived? And also, what is the difference between lived space and third space? Because Soya also talks about space being infinite and being, cutting across margins. It's an other space in Soya. Third space is an other space, something which pushes beyond the boundary constantly. And he compares this with Borges's Aleph. So would you like to, just a comment?
Okay, okay. So in the first one, you were asking, where is the synthesis in my conception? Yeah. Okay. So I would say, okay, we've got these representations of space. Take this, what you see on the screen, and we take this now the philosophical interpretation as a representational space. That means we live this, or when we play that, we live in an Aristotelian world, for example. And by this is feeding back into the spatial structure, because we are also behaving as if Aristotelian physics would be true. That means we are placing the bricks or the blocks. This is how the feedback in my model would work. And the other one is also right that in this third space book of Soja, it's going a step further. He's also trying to find, how could we say, a representation of representational spaces. And this he finds in Borges' Aleph. And Aleph at the same time is a symbol in math, in, what is it, Mengen theory, was that in English? Set theory, right, in set theory for the potentiality of a set. So that means you define the specifics, the characteristics of all possible elements of this set without naming them all. And for this he was, and in order to express that this is what actually a representational space is, so we could say the Golden Gate Bridge is part of the set of all bridges with the same feature. And for this relation, he was looking for another representation, and that representation was the Aleph, by designating just the mathematical operation, which you can also find in literature in Borges. So what he's trying to say is that this is not a process that is limited to certain operations going on, but this can always be found. And this, in his meta theory, he calls this the third space, or the othering, that this process is going on and always new spaces are produced or spaces are reproduced and so on. That's why he's introducing that figure. And I haven't thought about what this Aleph would be in computer games. So, but maybe you got some suggestions there.
I'm T. Nguyen from Utah.
Hi.
Valley University. So I'm really interested in this idea of presenting a novel spatial experience, but you seem to suggest, at least to some degree, that this was unique or novel to computer games, and I was wondering if that's really true. So there are a few examples. First, different board games present different forms of motion or interconnected between spaces, interconnectedness. So I'm thinking the difference between, say, the way the pieces move in checkers, and in particular, say, the difference between something like Go, where you have this stepped back view of the whole everything where you can move anywhere, versus something like Monopoly, where you have one piece that's moved, whether that shows a version of space. And I was also wondering if there was things like a carnival fun house with mirrors. Seems a lot like what you're talking about the third-person perspective, where you have the schizophrenic sense on your own motion. So I'm wondering if you think computer games are really novel, or if they're an extension of an older set of ideas.
Thank you very much. Great examples. And actually, maybe I I didn't read it well, but I can show you my manuscript. What I try to say is actually that I hope that this is going to be a new perspective in the philosophy of computer games. So not on media at all, or not as you said. I totally didn't actually, and definitely not want to say that computer games are the first media offering this other space experience. No, not at all. So you're totally right. I just say that this could be a new approach in the philosophy of computer games.
Yes, and just a question really about the notion of concept of space. You mentioned many kinds of concepts of space. I think cinematic space, battle space, Espen talked about that, segmented space, lived space. And it clearly seems to imply different concepts. But I'd just like to try out the idea that these are all relying on the same concept of space. It's like, could this be the case that we really have just one concept of space, and in addition to that we have sort of aspects of space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right and a bit wrong at the same time. You are right that I would also, what you addressed now was, I mean, especially in Lefebvre was lived space and practice space, conceived space. These are aspects of space, of the same space, which then is the concept of space. And there I think there are varieties, namely Aristotelian, Newtonian, Einstein's space, four-dimensional space. So that's what I address as concepts of space. Space we can find as conceptualized in sciences of space, claiming that this is a true model. And what we as philosophers should do is not set up new concepts of space, but use a notion of space with addressing different aspects of those spatial concepts we find. So.
Okay, I think now we have exactly 1 minute until 11 o'clock, so we've been pretty good with the timing and things. Now we have 15-minute break for coffee, and we come back again at 10:15 for the first paper. Okay, thank you very much.